Good evening, everyone. So pleased you could all join us. Welcome to this session that forms part of Renew's newly expanded Sustainable House Day program. My name is Fiona Gray and I'm the CEO of Renew. I begin our session this evening by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the respective lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Renew is committed to honouring Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's unique cultural and spiritual relationships to the land, water and sea, and their rich contribution to society. I also recognise that we have people tuned in from all over the country today from a wide variety of traditional lands. So thank you very much for joining us. Tonight, I'll be moderating a discussion with a really fantastic panel of experts exploring the topic of what homeowners can do to improve the bushfire resilience of existing homes using water and landscaping. In this session, we'll go over the basics of what you need to consider when considering resilient water setups, how passive water harvesting around your house can help improve your home's resilience to bushfire, along with landscaping and plant selection. While we're discussing ways to increase your home's survivability in the event of a bushfire, we really must emphasise that we are not advocating for people to stay and defend homes, and remind everyone that in the event of a bushfire, leaving early is always the safest option. I'm personally really looking forward to this session. There's been a lot of talk in our previous sessions about landscape and water. So I think, we'll all get a lot out of this. This is the third of a 4-part retrofitting resilience series running across the month of November. And we've already had some questions in the chat about the recording of these sessions. All of these sessions are being recorded and will be available on Renew's, Renew's YouTube channel. This program received grant funding from the Australian Government. This event is also supported by Natters, Design for Place, Your Home, Lighthouse Architecture and Science, Sonnen, Design Matters, Merribeck Council and Banyule Council. And we thank them all for their support. Okay, we're really excited to have you all join us. Hope that you will find this a really valuable session, and we're pleased to see registrations from almost every state and territory tonight. We predominantly have homeowners in the audience. However, we also have designers, architects, builders and council representatives. So I'm sure there's going to be something in this session for everyone. We're joined tonight by an excellent panel of experts who bring wide-ranging knowledge and a ton of experience on the topic of making homes and properties more resilient in the event of a bushfire. We've had a few little tech issues in the background before we started this evening. So we have Susan Bell and Nigel Bell joining us together. So firstly, I'll introduce Susan. Susan has qualifications in horticulture, landscape design, environmental management and strategic planning, with a master's degree in the latter. She has taught at TAFE and university across a range of related subjects and spent a number of years working as a consultant, designing numerous gardens across the Blue Mountains towns. From 2007 until 2020, she was employed as Principal Urban Designer at the Blue Mountains City Council and is also a registered landscape architect. Welcome, Susan, and thanks for taking the time to join us and share your knowledge and insights on these really important topics. We also have Nigel Bell, who has been a practicing architect and planner for over 3 decades within the bushfire-prone Blue Mountains and elsewhere, dealing with the full range of bushfire issues. He's been at the forefront from writing design guides, educating community and professionals involved in bushfire recovery in Victoria in 2009 and New South Wales in 2013. Nigel presented to the 2020 Royal Commission on behalf of the Australian Institute of Architects, where his evidence included the fundamental need for guidance on bushfire retrofitting for existing houses, that in many cases could mean reliance on active water sprinkler systems. Nigel has continued to promote these concepts to all 3 Australian standards to do with bushfire and building. Thanks so much to you, Nigel, for sharing your experience and expertise with us.
Pleasure.
And finally, we're joined by Leslie Corbett. Now, I will just also say that we've had some tech issues and we've got a bit of a croaky throat. So Leslie may need to drop out. She's soldiering on for the moment, and she may be a little bit quieter. So when Leslie's speaking, you may need to pop up your volume a little bit, but we'll see how we go. We're really pleased that she's still able to be with us, and hopefully she'll get through without any major coughing attacks. But Leslie is a writer and a keen gardener who lives in the Perth Hills in the southwest region of Western Australia. Late one night, she looked out the window and saw flames in the state forest not far from where she lives. The fire had been deliberately lit. Determined to make her garden more fire safe, she began researching plant flammability. Leslie's book, Safer Gardens, is the result of that research. This is citizen science. Leslie does not have a scientific background, but became very familiar with the subject in the years she spent researching plant flammability, and has assessed over 500 native and exotic plants based on plant flammability tests and reputable studies from around the world. So welcome, Leslie. We're so pleased to have you share your research findings and experience with us tonight as well.
Thank you.
Okay, let's get started. So during our discussion, I'll be putting viewers' questions to our panel, and thank you to everyone who submitted questions during the registration process. During the session, you can put questions into Zoom's Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. We will ask that if your question is related to a plant species or landscaping, it would be helpful if you could also add what state you are located in to help our panelists answer your questions. You can also see the chat window, so that's different to the Q&A function at the bottom. So in the chat window, that's for making general comments or to contact our behind the scenes team with any problems. And I just want to give a quick shout out to that team who aren't seen, but are always very busy in the background, making sure that the sessions run smoothly with, so many people joining the webinar. So thank you to Jess Storney, James King, David Watton, and Jackie Hagan. We really appreciate everything that you do. Before we begin, it would be great to get a sense of where you are all at in your retrofitting journey. We've been launching a poll across this whole series. So while this poll is not specifically around water and landscaping, it is really helpful for us to be collecting this data across the whole series because it helps with the research that we're also drawing from this work. So we're going to run this poll and invite you to choose a response that applies most to your situation. David, could you please launch that poll? Okay, hopefully people have had a chance to select an option. So we'll have a quick look at the results there. Okay, so the majority of people are looking for ideas about what changes they can make around their house only. We've got coming in second, looking at making some minor alterations and additions in and around the home. And on even pegging, I'm looking to do a full retrofit on my home and property, and I don't have anything planned, but a pretty reasonable even spread. That's useful information. Thank you for sharing that with us. Okay, well, I will get started with the first of our questions that we have received. And perhaps if I throw to you first, Nigel, wanting to know what is the value of water in a home's resilience to bushfire? So what are some of the fundamentals that should be considered in regards to using water around the home to help strengthen a home's resilience to bushfire?
Well, Fiona, it's obviously pretty fundamental. We've gone from 3 years ago, remarkable dryness, excessive drought, greater heat than ever before. Climate change has kicked in, and currently we're in the reverse. We're basically flooding in big parts of central and eastern Australia. But going back to the bushfire period, which will return again in future years, water is so fundamental. Aerial and satellite images showed of excessive dry moisture, soil content, right across eastern seaboard of Australia. That told the fire authorities in 2019, this fire was going to be more severe than ever before. Because if the ground is dry, therefore the plants are dry and it works its way up the stems into the canopies. And of course, we've seen where tree canopies, vegetation canopies lose their leaves when it is so dry. That's part of their survival mechanism that Sue or Leslie can talk more about than me. So first of all, once we get back into the bushfire season seriously, the more moisture in the ground, deep-rooted, surface moisture, the more vegetation, which is green and verdant, the far less likely you will get of ignitions, fire ignitions near your house, in your garden. So water is fundamental. And I do recall 3 years ago now, one of the rural fire service experts that I'm familiar with saying, literally 3 years ago, northern New South Wales, as a fire moved down the east coast, he said, I've never seen fire across what looked like bare ground because it was the moisture coming up. It was the organic material burning on what looked like bare ground, even getting under fences and continuing on. This, unfortunately, in climate change is our future. We need to prepare for resilience at every level, bushfire, and now, depending where you live, flood.
Would you like to expand on that, Sue?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot you can do in terms of water retention on site that hasn't been thought of before, not in relation to gardens as such. I think collecting water in water tanks is obvious off rooftops. Having a dedicated water supply for your garden in a tank is really important. Doing little things like, well, it sounds little, but it's actually quite important. If you live on a slope, and let's face it, most bushfire affected sites are on a slope, then one of your challenges will be getting moisture into the soil. I don't know about anyone else, but in the mountains, we have very sandy soils and they become water repellent when they dry out. And if you combine that with a slope, I've stood there with a hose and watched the water running off the surface and leaving the soil just as dry as it was before. So it's really important to work with your slopes to allow water to pool or pond and allow it to infiltrate, because you've got to get the water in the soil. Getting water in the soil means that all the plants that grow there can be fully hydrated or close to fully hydrated. There's all sorts of little techniques you can use to do that.
Swales are the obvious one, isn't it?
Yes. So, but I have a cunning little technique I use. Apart from my dedicated water supply, garden water supply in a tank, I have an overflow on it, and because it's been raining non-stop for 2 or 3 years, now the overflow flows all the time, and it goes into an energy dissipator, which is a big terracotta pot half full of gravel, and then it all burbles out the hole in the bottom and spreads across my lawn, which is essentially my defendable space. And so there's whenever it rains, there's water growing across the water just flowing in and fanning out across the lawn. So there's all sorts of cunning little techniques you can use in a garden design to maximize water infiltration. And as Nigel said, swales, which are actually critical on a sloping site.
Yeah, very clever. I like that idea. I'm interested, you did mention actually about sandy soils. I actually live in an area with I live on quite a hilly site, and water just gushes and in fact causes major problems with erosion because it's so steep. But it's very clayey and boggy. But because it's clay, it takes time for the water to be absorbed.
Yes.
So very similar problem. So I imagine the techniques are very similar for a different type of soil.
Funnily enough, there's techniques you can take from farming. There's a method called keyline farming, where there are swales which are gentle gutters dug into the surface, the soil surface, so that the water doesn't just run downhill. It actually ponds in these long hollows, and then it sits there, and because you've slowed it down and it sits there, it gets a chance to infiltrate. In some ways, I think clay soils are much harder in some ways than sandy soils.
So the swales have to follow the contours, though, don't they?
Yes, that's right.
To hold the water.
Yes.
And then, of course, we inherited at this house, I seem to remember, what was it? How would you call it? Something you strap on your shoes that had lots of spikes.
Yeah, aeration.
Yes.
Aeration. So you could walk up and down and aerate. And of course, that again, in clay soils, it helps get water starts to soak in rather than just running off the surface.
And get the bonus of some exercise while you're at it.
Yep.
And also you improve your soil, because with sandy soil, you need to build them up with organic matter. Funnily enough, with clay soils, you try to break them up with also organic matter, but aeration's particularly important with clay soils.
Great.
And you practice your tap dancing as you do it. Important.
Leslie, I think you may even have a case study story to share with us around the value of water and around the home.
I'm not sure which one you're referring to. I mean,
That's okay. Are there some examples? Can you think of some examples of simple mistakes that people make in regards to water setups? And
yeah, sure. Sorry, I didn't realise that's what you meant. I've got a friend whose plan is to stay and fight, and they've got excellent fire hose reels around the property. But then I noticed that the join at the standpipe was plastic, which will melt in a fire, and so you lose your access to water. So that's one thing, and then the another thing is water tanks. If they're made of plastic, I believe there are some more expensive types of plastic ones that don't burn on fire. Do you know anything about that, Susan and Nigel?
Do you know?
Sorry, what key point?
Special plastic water tanks that don't melt in a fire.
Sorry, I don't believe they exist in reality.
Yeah.
There is too much hype around these matters. Obviously, plastics will melt at a relatively low temperature, depending what it is. And whilst the stored water will keep, should we say, the base or to the level of water intact, the heat, radiant heat, will very quickly split, and you lose all your water supply within minutes if it's a genuinely intense bushfire. Fundamentally, don't have plastic tanks of any kind of plastic persuasion.
And we did actually, in the last session, there was quite an interesting discussion around water tanks. So I won't paraphrase the experts, but there is the recordings of the last session as well. So if people are wanting to dive a bit deeper into the issue of water tanks, there was some discussion in there as well around that. Okay, so some people, they've expressed, that they've received conflicting advice on the value of water spray systems to assist with a home's chance of survivability in the event of a bushfire. So, Nigel, what's the latest evidence on this, and perhaps what advice might you offer?
Okay. I sat on the 2012 Australian standard to look at water spray systems. That's the jargon they use, not sprinklers, water spray systems. We spent a lot of time going through all the ins and outs pushed by the 2009 fires. And at the end of the day, the official recommendation was only suitable up to BAL 19, to which, having donated, probably 10 or 20 days for nothing, I exploded and said, we've wasted our time. When the fire risk is BAL 19, that's relatively low. The time you need it is when you're in high and extreme bushfire, meaning BAL 40, flame zone. But the Australian standard played for safety and only recommended up to BAL 19. So when I and others brought it up more recently at the Royal Commission as being one of the fundamental things that could or should be done for retrofitting houses built in higher extreme bushfire areas. Is it 500,000? Is it 1 million Australian homes in that situation? Without spending a fortune changing the fabric, changing your windows, changing your roof, one of the simpler things is to add a water spray system. So that is agreed in principle, but there is still reference to the Australian Standard 5414, 2014. When, as part of the Australian Standard Committee, I said, where has it been used? Not one person of the 30 on the committee could find an example. It is a wasted space. It doesn't work. It is agreed in principle that it needs complete rewriting, but that hasn't happened yet. So, cutting to the chase, they can and do work, but there is a number of technical things to make sure they work when they're needed, because the fundamental problem is they rely on the amount of stored water. They rely on having metallic pipe systems, not plastic. They rely on having a series of, spray heads, of which there are 9 different kinds. Some work well, some work less well. Some use enormous amount of water for little benefit. So all of this is technically complex. And then you get to the fundamental, is there someone there with a capability to start it at the right time? Because if, as you hear on the media, there's a fire in the Blue Mountains, that could be 20 kilometers away from where our house is. We don't know. Mm. And so it comes back to also, how much stored water do you have? So can I give you one short example?
Absolutely, yeah.
2020, extreme fires in our region and elsewhere. My client with a house under construction said, I want our water tank converted for a water spray system. To which we said, yep, sure. We went to a plumber / designer, of which there are too few around, depending where in Australia you are located. He worked it out and said, yes, well, you'll go through 14,000 litres of water per hour.
Wow.
We had a 20,000 litre water tank buried in the ground deliberately before we knew there was going to be a water spray system. So that meant that, yes, it cost $25,000 extra building cost to put in a, well, I wouldn't say Rolls Royce, let's say a superior system for an average size new home, but it still came back to how long can it operate for at full operational capacity? Mm. So what I'm saying overall is they do work. There is anecdotal evidence of even simple things of people putting a garden sprinkler on the roof or spraying across their doors and windows, the most vulnerable parts. Typically it's the walls, the doors, the windows and gaps. So there is lots of evidence that that has saved many a building. But at this point of time, the Australian standard does not represent best practice or new knowledge. It will be upgraded, but that's going to happen over the next few years.
Okay.
So in the meantime, please don't be put off. Even simple systems as an added extra will help. But when it comes to bushfire and council regulations, there is no benefit. I argued and lost the argument about if you put in a conforming system, surely then you can reduce your bowel level on the house. It all became too hard because these kind of committees are essentially conservative. So yeah, so look for this space within the next year or two for an updated Australian standard. But in the meantime, any even simple home systems, as long as they're non-combustible, don't use, rubber hoses, don't use plastic hoses and expect them to last in a bushfire. But even simple systems are known to have saved many a house.
Can I just pick you up on something that you mentioned around at the very beginning of that, around the complexity? So if someone is not wanting to, throw good money after bad, how do they navigate that complexity without being an expert?
It's hard. That's part of the problem. In that, obviously, it's a lot of plumbing work, but there's only a limited number of household plumbers who even start to understand what's involved. In that, yes, there are companies, I've got one of their brochures here in front of me, Fire Pro, people that sell the gizmos. But number one is, how big is your water tank? Is it full, or how much water do you have at a client emergency? Second, what kind of pump do you have? Because there is so much evidence that using electric pumps, power fails often in an emergency. People then use petrol pumps. Oh, problem, because the petrol can evaporate and not be a liquid petrol to burn when you need it. So if you're considering putting in a system, you must use diesel fuel and a diesel pump with enough power to send, obviously, water through metal systems through to metal spray heads. So yeah, there's a number of steps in it, and that's why it depends totally on people's design capacity, what's installed, and then you don't want your great aunt trying to pull a starter pump lever at the time of the emergency. So that's why it's not straightforward.
Might just dwell on this for a little bit, because there are a number of questions coming in. So people are obviously quite interested in the systems. And Greg has asked, are there any, and anyone can answer this, whoever feels most comfortable to answer it, but Greg's asked, are there any recommended standard hoses and fittings for town water that are at least resilient?
It will depend upon which state and local government area, but essentially no. In New South Wales, there is a requirement to have a particular size, what's called a Storts fitting, which is what the fire brigade uses to connect. So they will use your fire water if they're there in an emergency situation, as well as their limited stored water on their tankers. But unfortunately, it varies across states and territories. But that's why it is relatively primitive at this point of time in terms of being able to give definitive advice. Can I say the big step forward was University of Wollongong. Dr. Alan Green did his doctorate for the first time in Australia, where he assessed scientifically the ins and outs of the different kind of sprays. Because the so-called butterfly spray, which gives a lot of water, big droplets, uses huge quantities of water. So is that more effective than a very fine mist spray on the windows? This is the kind of discussion technically which is continuing on, to which we do not yet have full answers. But as I said, given a year or two, it'll be clearer. And certainly, as I say, anecdotally, even household systems, garden water spray systems have made a difference in some circumstance. So don't be put off, Mr. and Mrs. person listening in. Keep trying, and certainly you need a metal or concrete water tank. The more stored water you have, inherently the better, particularly when it's in drought. And yeah, just keep working at it.
Can I add something there?
Yeah, absolutely. Go, Leslie.
I was told by someone who lives in the Tilden Park estate, which got really badly hit by the 2021 Woolloomooloo fire. 56 houses in that estate were lost. And she said that every house that had a water spray system survived. So it can definitely work some of the time.
Yes.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's sometimes those anecdotes are more powerful than you know, the data when you actually look at how a whole community stacks up. I mean, obviously, you know, the data is really important, but some of those anecdotal things, even when you see in the media, you know, it's quite interesting. Carolyn has asked around the sprinkler systems, and you talked about the quantity of water that's needed to keep them going. Are people allowed to tap into main supplies for sprinklers? She said she's heard of people leaving their homes with the sprinklers running that went to the mains water supply, and then they cut off the whole neighbourhood because it was draining the reservoir during the 2019-20 fires.
Yes, that's the problem. Obviously, when a fire comes through, everyone is trying to hose down or use sprinklers. Fire brigades are connecting in. So typically there is a total lack of town water, pumped water available. And that's the point of needing to have your own water tanks, your own dedicated water supply. And in many areas, many councils across Australia, it is now mandated, both for household use, you have a certain amount of water. I mean, in New South Wales, it might be 5,000 litres or 10,000 litres. And then, depending on your location, another 10,000 litres dedicated for firefighting. So that might mean there's one water tank, but for household use, it comes off at half the height. And at the bottom is the one dedicated for firefighting. And they will use all the water they can get when the emergency happens, to try and save your home. But as I'm sure everyone listening understands, and certainly they keep repeating in New South Wales, we can't be sure there'll be a fire tanker outside your home at the very time you most need it. We have to be resilient. We have to prepare ourselves, our family, our street, our neighborhood. And that's the key point of, I'm sure, all of these webinars.
Absolutely. Susan, did you want to add anything there around the water spray systems?
No, that's really outside my level of expertise, unless you're talking about gardens, of course. And I noticed that there was a question from somebody about the most efficient way of watering their garden. I was going to say that I think the drip irrigation is still the most efficient way of using water, particularly in dry settings or during a drought. It's very, much more efficient than sprinkler systems. And it ensures, if you've got that reliable watering in the soil, then you're looking at the best hydration for your plants.
Can I add something there?
Yeah, go, Leslie.
Of course.
So one of the issues that brings up is at a time of drought. I mean, over here in the West, we're permanently apart from overwinter on water rationing. But, you know, I mean, I remember when Melbourne went down to extremely low amounts of water that they were allowed to use. So you have to think that might happen to you wherever you are. You know, you may be put on an extreme water rationing, in which case it's going to matter if you've mainly chosen plants that are very thirsty, or if you've chosen more drought hardy plants. You know, I mean, there's a little bit of a problem there because quite often the plants that are really thirsty, and I'm thinking of something like Camellia japonica here, are actually pretty good for fire.
Yep.
So, I mean, you know, if you grow them in the conditions that they like, if you put them in shade and you protect them from the afternoon sun, you're not going to need to put as much water on them. But you're also going to have to be prepared to sacrifice plants if you're in a severe drought and plants are starting to die, rather than leave that big plant there full of dead matter. You may have to actually think, okay, cut that down for now, start again next season, you know?
So, and there's some other issues too. For example, plant selection, as Leslie refers to, is really important. But I think also maybe being strategic about your watering. Well, I'll take a step back. First of all, have a dedicated supply for your garden, which I know is really difficult in a drought when you're suffering hardship, you know, maybe even in household supply. But I've mentioned my dedicated water supply, and it's been very useful. And then also be prepared to use it. And of course, mulch. But when you talk about mulch, you have to talk about or think about the flammability of mulch. And so select mulches that aren't flammable. But I think also you can never underestimate the importance of maintenance in gardens, particularly during drought, to remove, you know, dead stuff and take it well away.
It's interesting talking about, you know, water rationing and drought when, you know, most of the East Coast is currently in flood, but it's a really timely reminder because, you know, we are seeing such extremes. And one thing I've just experienced with flooding is all my mulch is gone, just completely gone. So you've sort of almost got to start again, just got picked up and washed away.
Well, can I say, part of the technical assessment after bushfires, which fire authorities in every state follow up with, unfortunately, that information is not readily available because everyone, government authorities and regulators, are concerned about liability. But what is quite clear is that particularly things like pine bark and mulch, which is highly combustible, can carry the fire right up to the building. And that is now identified as one of the key ignition points, too common across Australia. So when it comes to mulch, increasingly, the advice is going to become, unfortunately, not organic mulch within proximity to the walls of buildings, but it's going to be gravel or other things that allow water permeability, but not transmit flame right to the base of the building.
Yes, absolutely. Nigel, there's been a question from Melina that she'd like you to comment on, building on what we spoke about before around the sprinkler systems. There was a suggestion earlier in this series that a sprinkler system that moistened the landscape around the house rather than the house infrastructure itself was a better option. So would you like to comment on that? Do you have a view on that?
I do. The Australian standard suggests putting sprinklers on the roof, to which my response was then and now, how useless, because the wind is going to carry that water away. Anecdotally, I spent time in Maryville, 2009, following their fire, and there is a number of excellent examples where they put under the gutter, they put a metal pipe, and then they put down across the face of the building, they put fine spray mist system. So it just kept it wet at the most vulnerable areas. I have a current project, without trying to explain too much, where on the northern bushfire frontage, because of the steep slope, flame zone, we will have sprinklers, again, at gutter level, but mostly going across the face of the building and a little bit on the roof. But to the reverse, on the rear, we are going to be absolutely wetting the vegetation, which is exotic vegetation, and having sprinklers that absolutely mean that behind the building, it is wet on vegetation which is not readily flammable. So different sides of the building, hot and dry, highly flammable, different response, yes, a ring main, sprinklers of a different kind behind the house to keep it super wet. So yes, she's exactly on the right track. Look carefully at the direction of the fire front. Think about where the sun moves, the hottest, the driest, the most vulnerable, and then also look behind and around, and you should look carefully at your system as a result.
Great.
Site responsive.
I know we're jumping around a little bit, but there's some really great questions coming in, and they're all sort of related. Back, just taking a step back on the mulch issue again. And Leslie, you may want to contribute on this as well. Is mulching, Karen's asked, is mulching gardens good or bad in a fire-prone area? So you spoke to having it close up to your house, but I think she's talking more about the garden beds themselves. And she said she mulches quite a lot to try and conserve water in the ground, and she's got native garden beds. And that's practical for her because she's not at the property all of the time. It's a rural site and they have limited tank water. So I suppose, how do you clarify that conflict between mulching close to the house and garden beds?
Well, I think that I just don't think there's any question that you need to mulch. And once fire is in the equation, then you need to mulch with something not combustible. And so, the choices are pretty restricted when it comes to that combination. But yes, particularly if you're not at the property very often and it's not a property that has a high level of maintenance, I don't think there's any question that you really have to mulch if you want to grow plants successfully.
Okay,
Can I add
great.
something there?
Yes.
So the advice that I hear constantly is that near the house, you should definitely use hard, non-combustible mulches. I mean, you can use pebbles, but they're super expensive. I use gravel and I use coffee rock. And it's really, really hot. Wherever like if I've got a lamandra, wherever the tips touch that gravel or that rock, they burn from the heat. And, you can just go out there on a super hot day and you can feel the heat coming off it. But it's what I do near the house because that's the safest. The CFA has one suggestion to make, and that is that you put down mulch at the start of winter. And if it hasn't all decomposed by the time fire season comes around, you could perhaps put a layer of sand or something like that over the top of it. There's a couple of other things. One is that lightweight mulches such as straw readily become airborne embers in a fire. And the other thing is that with high mulches such as bark, but most mulches, they tend to smolder and run along underground even, and then pop up again and start the fire going again, even after the fire front has gone through. There's also, so there was a vineyard in Victoria. I spoke to the people there about Black Saturday, and they said that all the plants that they had mulched burned, and the heat of the fire was greater in those areas where there was mulch, and whereas the other plants didn't burn. So that's another issue. But one of the things that you can do if you are using those mulches like bark, and I think bark tends to be the one that they suggest is best for water penetration, is islands of mulch, so that you don't have the whole area in your building protection zone mulched. You break it up into little corridors that are separated by lawn, paving, even bare earth, so that you're reducing that amount, that problem of the mulch transferring, even just underground, even just creeping along and then flaring up again. The other thing that happens is that trees get ring barked by mulch in a fire. And they might, trees that might otherwise have survived, I've read quite a bit of stuff about this on Black Saturday, then died.
Oh, really?
So there's a lot of issues.
Yes, yeah, okay. Darcy's asked, you spoke about gravel being so hot, but Darcy asked is gravel a good alternative for retaining water and fire protection in a native garden?
I don't have a lot of experience with gravel, although I think what occurs to me is the thickness of the gravel layer is also important, that it's got to be thick enough to prevent evaporation, keep the water moist and cool. Leslie's experience is really interesting there, so the type of gravel you use might also be quite important. Yeah, so sorry, I've forgotten the question now.
You know, no, you did answer the question. It was about putting gravel in a native garden. So,
can I just make
yes, go ahead.
Make the point that the bushfire building regulations particularly focus on the lowest 400 millimeters from ground or on a deck, because that is where the burning debris, the mulch or the leaves will collect and then keep festering, and that's known to contribute to many a house loss, the bottom 400 millimeters. So there is a different set of regulations above 400 millimeters than the lowest 400. So yeah, so for example, you can't have timber posts going too close to the ground. When you're in a higher extreme bowl, it's got to be metal. If you do have a timber post in a lower bowl, it's got to be higher than 400 millimeters off a horizontal or gently sloping surface, because that's where historically the research has shown that's where ignitions occur.
Look, frankly, the older I get and the more I hear about all of this, the more I'm coming around to the view that you don't have garden beds adjacent to the house. And I think there's a lot of practical reasons why you might pave, whether it's concrete path or unit paving, adjacent to a house. And then beyond that, for on the other side of the path, I think having low planting really makes more sense. And I just think that's really sensible for particularly in urban setting, very urban settings, but you could apply it anywhere.
Okay, great. We might keep moving on to the next question. There's a couple of questions that have already been asked that relate to this, and I will get to them if I can, but just broadly speaking, and perhaps if you could respond to this first, Leslie, what are the key things that people need to consider when selecting plant species that are more resilient to bushfire?
Yeah, so obviously one of the most important is there any information about how quickly it ignites? But there's a whole lot of other issues. One is the bark. You actually, if you're thinking about putting a plant in, it pays to do some research and even go and look at it growing somewhere else, because you mightn't know that the bark is really flaky and rough, and so could enable fire to reach the canopy of a plant that you're putting in. You really, it's very, very useful to know if the plant accumulates a lot of dead material or drops a lot of litter. And then if you happen to know how flammable that litter is, that helps you assess whether it's worth growing. I mean, one thing that springs to mind is bananas. You know how they always have a lot of dead material within them. The green leaves of bananas in tests are low flammability, but the dry leaves are really high. And tall kangaroo, Anagoxanthus flavidus, is another prime example. The green leaf is low flammability, but the clumps always have a whole lot of dead material in them, and they are very flammable. I've got it growing in a pot, and I cut out all the dead stuff, but it's quite a chore. It's, you know, and if you've got a plant growing in the garden, it'll become quite big, and there'll be quite a lot of stuff that you've got to regularly get rid of. There's the other things that you need to know are, as we touched on earlier, does it require shade? You know, last summer we had a hoa period of about 7 days that were over 40 and were often up near 46, and a whole lot of plants that had never suffered before burnt in my garden. So I'm starting to think that we have to give plants a bit of shelter from the western sun if we can, but then we've also got to make sure that we don't create a fuel ladder. So there's all sorts of ways in which you can create a fuel ladder. Any shrub under a tree can become a fuel ladder. Climbers are really, really dangerous from that point of view. They're very, very well aerated by nature of the fact that they're growing upwards. There's lots and lots of air around them. They have a lot of dead stuff behind the outer cloak of greenery usually, which can be really hard to get access to get rid of, especially if it's a climber that goes pretty high. They can choke off if they do get into the canopy, quite apart from the fact that can be a fuel ladder. They can also kill off a lot of the leaves within that tree, and therefore increase the flammability of the tree itself. Yeah, so and ground covers, your maintenance has got to be good. So many ground covers look lush, and you look underneath and it's just this dense mat of dead material.
That's an interesting point, because Adam asked earlier if you have any suggestions for a non-grass, low maintenance, in other words, minimal mowing, drought tolerant ground cover as a replacement for grass.
Nope.
Nope.
And to be
Sorry,
honest,
Adam.
to be honest, I'm struggling to find. You know, I agree that we should have low plants, close, you know, in the garden area nearest the house. But as far as ground covers go, I'm struggling to find ones that have tested as having low flammability that don't have other negative features. For instance, Myoporum parvifolium, creeping rubiella, is reasonably well known as having low flammability, green leaves. But you plant that, you've got a dripper on the spot where you plant it, and then it starts spreading out and rooting as it goes. So it gets wider and wider. And the bits that are furthest from where your trickle part is start to die in the heat. Like last year, even the bits near the trickle, to be honest, I pulled it out. It just got hammered in the heat. So, I mean, one thing you could do to help a plant like that survive is, you know, give it shade from the western sun. It might be really, really useful in a spot where you can keep it a bit cooler, and you can give it a bit of extra water. I tried putting up extra drippers, but it was too far and too wide, and I didn't have enough water pressure to be able to put, you know, 20 more or whatever in. Yes.
I tend to use ground covers. I've got an old apple tree here, and I use ground covers under the old apple tree, where they're quite protected anyway. But I was going to, there was a question there about, does anybody know of a good climber that's flame resistant? And I've got absolutely no idea, and it's not in your book, Leslie. I've been pouring through your book. It's Chinese star jasmine, Trachelospermum.
Yeah.
Because it's got the white resin or sap. No, the sap, and it's got waxy leaves, a bit like camellias. And it strikes me as being a possible candidate for reasonably fire resistant.
I'm with you.
But I was going to say it's poor horticultural practice to run any climber up a tree for the reasons that you referred to, that they often harbour all sorts of insects. In wet weather, they get, you can get fungal infections underneath them, and they're actually not good for the tree.
And the other thing that people do with creepers and vines is they plant them against the house or against the veranda.
No.
So, and then it's just, that goes up in flames. It gets into your roof of our house. They need to be kept away from houses.
Leslie, for me as a non-gardener, one of your key points was the way you mentioned that while succulents might, or not succulent, but plants might look fantastic on the outside, the amount of dead material behind, which is highly fire prone, highly flammable. So yes, I said I'm no gardener, I leave it to Sue. But that whole point of plant selection, understanding the qualities that will either encourage or inhibit the spread of flame, the spread of heat. And yes, climate is inherently problematic, and particularly if you put them up against your building.
And that comment about lawns or grass, the maintenance of grass or lawns, the mowing, has been, wonderfully mechanised over the last century, so that they're really easy to mow, especially if it's well planned and it's not too sloping and it's only as big as it needs to be and no bigger. And my lawn is part of my defendable space, and it's only kept 70 millimetres.
Thanks.
And it takes 20 minutes to mow, and so it gets done once a fortnight in summer, and then it may not need a mow for 3 months in winter, but I'm in a particularly cool climate. But I think if you're sensible about a lawn, it could be quite functional, especially in an urban setting. Having acres and acres of lawn, so you need a ride-on mower, I just don't think that works, because then you've got to let the grass, how do you maintain that? It takes so much time and resources. So I think that's a different issue on larger lots that are larger than an urban setting.
Great. So before we move on, you did say that you're furiously sort of flicking through Leslie's book. I know she's too modest to promote it herself, so I will give it a plug now. If anyone is interested in having a look at that book, it's called Safer Gardens, Plant Flammability and Planning for Fire. So do check that out. There you go. We've even got a model. So that's great. Leslie, are fire retardant lists generally reliable for plants species?
Unfortunately not. They often contain plants that actually are the opposite, that are flammable. And I spent years innocently planting things that, according to various lists, had what they called fire retardant, which is a term I don't agree with anyway, because virtually no plants are actually retardant. I call them low flammability. But no, most of them are unreliable. There'll be at least a few plants on there that are actually highly flammable. One of the issues is people copy each other. That you can't even get to the end of the trail of where that information came from. They don't mention their sources usually. They can be based on anecdotal information, which is I've got a section in my book on how various gardens have fared in fires, and it's absolutely fascinating. But you can't rely on it because it's subjective, and people can leave out absolutely basic information, like a helicopter, a water bomber came over. and they weren't there to see it or whatever, Yes, so just I just discovered when I was trying to be more fire-wise in my gardening, I gathered a lot of fire retardant lists, and then I started discovering, oh, but I know that plant is flammable. What's going on here? And so that's why I went to plant flammability research from around the world. I've drawn together studies that have happened in many areas. The Mediterranean is obviously similar issues to us, California, similar issues, but I mean, I've even got stuff from Switzerland in there. Sometimes that information actually contradicts each other. You've got two different people finding different things about a plant, but that's often, there's no standard way of testing a plant's flammability. So someone might test midsummer, someone else might test midwinter, which can account for some of the differences. But yeah, I would urge people not to trust fire retardant lists. You could be planting things near your house that are actually flammable and that are worsening your fire risk. And I'll just mention one other thing. So in America, some counties require people to plant according to their lists of what is so-called fire retardant. And I've read 2 papers, I think both were Californian, absolutely withering about those plant lists and how unreliable they are. So it's not just a problem in Australia, it's a problem generally.
And there's a broader question about species that are endemic or suitable for your microclimate, your soils, your weather, etc. And too often plant lists are sort of generic and statewide or even broader, and suggesting things that are really not right at all kinds of levels. I agree.
Yeah.
I'm interested, before you spoke about the, the roughness of the bark, different qualities of particular trees. And yet I've been told that I've got a lot of mooners on the property that I live on, and that has a really rough, rugged bark, and it does not look intuitively, I don't know a lot about the plant, but it doesn't look intuitively like it would be fire retardant, but I'm told it is. Can there be confusing plants like that?
Well, first of all, I don't know what a mooner is.
Is that a paper bark?
Look, I've only ever known them as mooners, so I don't really know.
What colour is it?
It's grey. They're very old, ancient trees. I don't want to send you off on a tangent having to do the encyclopedic work now, but it just seems counterintuitive given the bark, the roughness of the bark, and it seems like there's probably bits that flame and embers could grab onto.
A paper bark, Melaleuca. Somebody, Cassia Reed says, Mooner is Melaleuca lanceolate, a paper bark. It doesn't sound particularly flame resistant to me, I have to say, without knowing.
Yeah, okay. Maybe I should be trusting that gut instinct that maybe, Google is not quite right on that one. Just moving on to something a little bit different around, Carolyn's asked about planted bamboo for screening. Is this a bad choice for a bushfire prone area?
Yes. So bamboo clumps, whether they're bamboo or philostachys, bambusa, which is the clumping one, I think. Am I right, Susan?
Bambusa, yep.
Or the one that spreads out everywhere. You look at a clump of them, they have so much dead litter in amongst them, just so much. And I do have a test for one of the spreading bamboos that indicates that it's very flammable and that the dry leaves are very flammable.
Okay.
So yeah, not good. The other thing I might add to that, actually, at the last house that we were in, we had a clump of the clumping bamboo. And we spent 3 days on alert to evacuate that year. And this, I decided it was too close to the house, so I cut it down and left it down in the valley on the burning pile. And when we lit the fire that winter, it was like gunshot going off across the valley.
Wow.
It was scary. Hey, my theory, and I could be completely wrong, is that it's because of the hollowness of the bamboo stems. Does that make sense to anybody? That there'd be all that extra oxygen maybe to feed it and make it go bang, bang, bang.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll move on to the last pre-prepared question that we have. Sue, are there ways to lay out a garden that builds in resilience to bushfire and reduces the risk of fire spreading rapidly through it?
Look, this is really important. And I noticed on some of the questions I've seen so far, there's a few questions where people are focusing in on detail about combinations of plants or particular plants or sprinkler systems or whatever. Before you do any of that, you have to consider your layout of your garden, because that gives you the setting that you can have some element of control over. So in fact, I made notes because I figured it was going to be a big issue. So the layout gives you a chance to plan, and the planning is so important. First of all, the New South Wales Rural Fire Service guides focus almost entirely on managing vegetation. And in fact, the framework of the garden is the key to being able to manage your vegetation. So, and as a garden designer, there's another issue I want to raise here. If you're really unlucky, you might get a fire through your property every few years, right? That's fairly frequent turnover, maybe 8 or 10 years. Life goes on in between fires, and people use their gardens for all sorts of things. Could be anything from repairing their car to, you know, of course, the barbecue, or, you know, people might want to go more rarefied than that. So life goes on in between fires. So that, in fact, makes it even more important to lay out your garden to give the defences longevity, so that after 10 years of the last fire going through, wasn't it terrible, you know, people forget all the precautions that you need to take, or they become blasé. So it's really important to build in your fire defences. And so the set out is incredibly important. The first thing is that in your setting out, you need to provide the defendable space. And I think mentioning the defendable space, I should also mention the best guidelines in a broad design sense that I've seen are the Country Fire Authority of Victoria's Landscaping for Bushfire. And they actually have a section before they get down to plant selection and any other issues. They have a section on setting out.
Design.
Design. So when you set out your garden, it means you're providing a defendable space, you're arranging the plant material to consider a number of issues, but fire, and you're, the other thing is that in all this, I should mention other value systems. So I think I've mentioned that it's really hard in between, you know, during the years between fires to stay true to the fire standard, because you've got powerful incentives that Leslie has referred to get some climate modification in, to get some summer shade, winter sun, and all that other stuff. So there's a number of value sets involved in this setting out. For some people, productivity is really important. So their vegetables are incredibly important. So anyway, I should say this is very valuable and really worth a look. In the set out of the garden, it really pays then not just the defendable space, but locating all your moist kind of activities that need water adjacent to the house and on the what would normally be the fire approach side. So veggie gardens, for example, they get a lot of maintenance, which means you're constantly weeding them and taking away dead material, and they usually need a fair bit of water. So that's good fire defensive practice as well. If you have a swimming pool, putting the swimming pool on the fire approach side, or a dam, or even a pond, a water feature or something. Building in interruptions to the ground plane. So if you have a fire creeping along the ground plane in grass or whatever, having a low retaining wall, incombustible, non-flammable retaining wall, built out of old bricks or stone or even recycled concrete or whatever, does help to slow the fire down. And then building in swales behind the retaining walls so that you're precipitating or you're facilitating, water infiltration into the ground. So setting out the garden, they're just a few examples. So setting out the garden up front is incredibly important, and it allows you to actually formalise some of your fire defences, the ones that lend themselves to being formalised and built in. So,
really good advice. What
Can
about?
I add something to
yeah,
that?
go ahead, Leslie. Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a couple of issues that I forgot to mention earlier. One is keeping tree crowns separate from each other to try and prevent crowning fires, because they're much hotter and harder to control. Generally, people say 2 meters apart. I have seen in the WA Fire Authority saying 10 meters, which I think is a bit of a big ask. But yeah, placement of trees is an issue. Hedging is an issue. The very nature of hedging a plant means that a lot of dead material accumulates inside because everything's planted really close together. It doesn't get the light in. And it's because of its density, it's hard to actually get in there and remove the dead stuff. And it can then, if it's badly placed, like if it's lining your driveway and coming up close to your house, it can act as a fuse. One of the things I do with shrubs is I clean away all the bottom, I strip them bare at the bottom so that they're like miniature little trees almost, to try and, so that if I haven't got round to the latest lot of eucalyptus leaves that have fallen around all the plants, if they start burning, it's less likely. There's a bit of a gap between that and where the leaf of the shrub is. So that's a useful technique to use. And that thing about separating areas with mulch applies to separating little areas of the garden as well. Like, you know, try not to have your garden laying out in a way where one plant burning is going to dry out the next lot of plants next to it and enable them to catch fire really easily. Another thing I didn't mention is weeds. That's a really big issue. If you live near bush, we have an obligation not to spread our garden plants into the forest. And I mean, where I live, Italian lavender is just spreading everywhere from a couple of gardens on one side of the road, and the forest is across the road from us. That's a very flammable plant, but it's also a very short-lived plant. Good, in my opinion, good fire practice is to minimize your plantings of short-lived plants, because as they come towards the end of their life, they start to accumulate a lot of dead material. I mean, obviously, if you're into pulling out, as soon as that happens and planting something new, you can control it, but it's just something that needs to be thought about. But so in the case of something like the Italian lavender, that is spreading along at ground level amongst the forest. Now that is already a dry material, even with the green leaf. Can you imagine when it all dies off and you've got this carpet there of dead stuff? It's just adding so much to the fuel load. Another thing is that we haven't talked about is deciduous trees, and some of the problems that are starting to emerge about that. I mean, for starters, most people think all deciduous trees are low flammability. My research does not agree with that. For instance, Betula pendula is tested as high flammability at silver birch, which I imagine a lot of people would be disappointed to hear. But one of the issues that's emerging is the fire season is lasting longer, and so it's often going well into autumn at a time when deciduous trees are turning and their leaves are starting to crisp up, or they've fallen in drifts. And so I've seen people advocate having a ring of deciduous trees really close to your house for shade in winter, in summer, and then light in winter. If you're doing that and fire comes through in autumn, there's a big risk that your house might not be safe. So yeah. And one other thing too is giving firefighters access to your property. You need to make sure your driveway is broad enough to take a fire vehicle, because they're pretty big. Fire engines are pretty big, and on bigger properties, ideally they need to have a turning circle to get out quickly if the situation changes. No trees overhanging that block their access. I know some people down south the fireys had to pass over their house and go and try and save another one because the access wasn't good enough. So yeah.
Nigel, what about other structures such as fencing? We haven't touched on that sort of thing too much yet.
Just before we're there, can I give an anecdote in terms of what we've just discussed? One of my projects survived bushfires twice over in the last 10 years, written up in Sanctuary magazine a year and a half ago. The two key points. One was they had 100,000 litres of stored water on two 50,000 litre concrete tanks on the western slope, which shielded the house. Fundamental problem, they had the Storts fitting for access on the fire side, the wrong side. They couldn't use it when the fire came through because they couldn't get to it. These simple things that you have to be aware of. However, they also had used some leftover Hebel blocks, AAC, it's a non-combustible blocks from a previous attempt at a house. So they used that along the contours, and that again stopped the ground level fire. And written up in Sanctuary was the fact between the water tanks and the low level fire being stopped, it's the one house on the street that survived when 15 or more others all went. And the one other problem was the multi-stemmed eucalypt, which was nearby, that burned for hours, and that took out the heritage car. It became molten aluminium and metal, but the house survived. So yeah, the point about moisture, water, and shielding. Now, to your question, yes, obviously fences can make a big difference. Personally, I'm not in love with ColourBond metal fences for all kinds of reasons I won't go into, but they do slow and in many cases stop the radiant heat and the progression of the fire onto a house. The worst of all is the most common dividing fence in suburbia these days, which is a treated pine. And of course, they will ignite readily, they'll burn fiercely with great heat. And there is more and more evidence that they are the worst possible thing to put when you're in a suburban situation as a dividing fence. We live in a 100-year-old, 110-year-old house with another one, 4 or 5 meters away. And then they were insisted on exactly that wrong fence. We end up lining our side with rusty corrugated metal to try and minimize, because certainly the radiant heat from plants on the boundary or burning fences, there is good data about how that has ignited many a home, and or as the radiant heat has cracked standard annealed glass, and then once the glass is cracked and the wind has sucked it out, then the fire actually ignites the curtains or inside the building. So the lesson as a whole is look carefully at what kind of fence, how close to your building, what is the material, how flammable is it, and consider then also, as Leslie has said and Sue, the low-level planting nearby that could also contribute to increased heat, flame, intensity on the walls or the windows and doors of your building.
Great. I'll keep us moving because we've now sort of come to the end of the questions that were pre-submitted as part of the registration process. So thank you to everyone who submitted those. Just a reminder that if you still would like to submit your questions for the panel, you can do that in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And we'll use the rest of the time that we have left together to answer as many of those questions as possible. I'll move on to a question from Shannon in Tasmania. Are there any types of vine species capable of surviving nearby flames and acting as a fire retardant against ember attack?
Well, this question came up earlier and I asked Leslie if she'd seen any evidence in relation to Chinese star jasmine, Trachelospermum jasminoides, because it's kind of got really waxy leaves, a bit like camellia, and it's got a thick, white, juicy sap. She hadn't seen any evidence anywhere, any work on Chinese star jasmine. But that's my best suggestion.
Well,
Great.
my reaction when I see star jasmine is exactly the same as yours. I think that's a likely candidate to be a low flammability one. And I mean, that is partly, using your judgment like that is partly what you have to do, because not all plants have been studied, you know, even if you're prepared to go along with the science or not prepared, you know. I mean, that thing about the juicy leaf, ivy geranium, it has over 90% moisture content in its leaf. I think aloe had about 96%. If leaves are soft and fleshy and when you tear them there's moisture in it, that's often a good sign that it's going to be low flammability.
Besides which, I have to say, I think Chinese star jasmine is what we call in the industry a well-behaved climber.
Exactly, yes.
It only gets 2 or 3 meters tops. It's
So
not
I did
wisteria, not like wisteria, which will literally prise all the timber joints of your house open. Sorry.
That's so pretty.
They can be dangerous things, vines. I did look up some things on this subject.
Yes.
So passion fruit has very low flammability, but it's short-lived and it develops a lot of dead material as it ages. You could deal with that by just deciding after 4 years out it comes new one in, because it does grow pretty quickly. You should be aware that Nellie Kelly variety suckers, and those suckers seed prolifically. You'll be pulling up seedlings for years. There are what do you call it? Just normal passion fruit that's not been grafted. That's the word I'm after. Don't do that. There's a native passion fruit. Now, see, a lot of these plants are Eastern States plants. I'm not familiar with them. Passiflora herbertiana,
don't know.
has very low flammability. You don't know it either, Sue? Okay, so I don't know how long it lives or how vigorous it is. We want a vigorous one. Kiwi fruit has low flammability. It's a long-lived deciduous climber that can cover a massive 9 meters.
Yeah.
So you'd have to place it so carefully. It would just be sitting duck there for fuel ladder. And also, if it's going to be climbing all over the place, it's well aerated. And so if it's got dry bits, those dry bits are going to go, and they're going to take anything nearby with it.
If you were really concerned about growing your own food and you wanted that kind of plant, it would make sense to put it on a separate structure. You wouldn't have it anywhere
away from the house. Yeah,
you'd have it on a shade structure, which could be sacrificed if it was needed to.
Yeah, I agree. And in case people are wondering, grapevines do not test well.
Right.
Moderate to high flammability. But you know, the stories out of Black Saturday and other fires are very variable. Some people's vines survived, some just got obliterated. One person had just put a whole lot of manure around theirs and it burnt beautifully and they went with it. Somebody else set up a spray and his one survived, but a lot of them don't survive. Yeah.
Sue, do you remember that photograph that we took in Marysville or near Marysville after the 2009 fires, where the fire had spread across the grass? There was it a camellia hedge?
No.
What was it?
This is another issue, a bit off the topic, but in terms of unpredictability, the fire had raced across this paddock to a young conifer hedge. And I think it was Leighton's green. It grows really, really big at some stage. And it had just charred the green outside. And otherwise, the trees were powering on a year later, very happy, thank you.
And it had saved the timber house just on the other side. So it was a classic where the fire had burnt half the hedge and then the other half remained green, and the fire had continued on and saved the house.
Now, in Ash Wednesday fires, and I can see you looking puzzled, Leslie, because pine trees explode like they're bombs, you know.
And pine cones roll away and start new fires.
So, but on the cover of Landscape Australia was it the old Ash Wednesday of the 1980s? There's an aerial photo of a really big old Victorian Italianate mansion surrounded by what looks like mature Monterey cypresses. And everything outside, what had acted as the windbreak outside the Monterey cypresses, was burnt to a crisp. And the cypresses and the inside of the windbreak, including the house, were perfect, untouched.
Wow.
Yeah, my understanding is that most cypresses do accumulate a lot of dead material. Young ones mightn't have accumulated a lot yet. But, you know, I mean, it always begs the question, when you see a photo like that, you can jump to conclusions. Like, I remember in the Stoneville fire, seeing this house absolutely unblemished, and this line of a hedge, similar to what you just described, just really close. And I thought, oh, wow, that must be low flammability. And then it clicked. No, the firefighters would have had to have focused on that hedge to save the house, because it was so close to the house and it was pretty tall too. I mean, they say, you know, no plant greater than 2 meters within 2 meters of the home. You know, it was definitely way taller than that. So, and when you see photos, you never know what the backstory is, you know, like what intervened. Was there a wind change even, you know? I mean, yeah.
That's really good advice, Leslie. We mentioned before, when you were talking about values, Sue, we did touch on, some people want productive gardens. Clancy in Victoria has asked about the best ornamental or productive nut to plant as a shade tree in suburban Geelong. Are you familiar with Geelong? It's not that far out of, it's about an hour out of Melbourne.
Yeah. And I did have a quick look at this earlier. I was wondering, and I'd be interested in Leslie's opinion on almond.
Don't have tests on almond.
I think it's in your book.
Yeah,
but I've forgotten the botanical name.
Prunus something or other.
That's right. And most of the prunus family are not particularly flammable.
This is the prunus family.
Yeah,
you're talking about. Yeah. I do have information indicating that the prunus family is not particularly flammable, but I also have Doc Miller, who is I think a botanist, and fought the Sycamore Canyon fire at his house, saying that the fire was almost stopped by macadamias and I think it was avocados, but the prunus went up really well. I have been in correspondence with him, and it was a severe drought year, and previous years have been very bad drought as well. And water was being given to the avocados and other citrus, I think, in preference to the prunus. So they were definitely drought stressed. One problem with a lot of prunus is that they sucker. Would you agree with that?
Look, they're so variable. Depends if they're grafted, because a lot of the ornamental species are grafted, and if they undergo any hardship, they sucker from the rootstock.
Yeah.
Many of them are just low branching, like they branch sort of this far from the ground. And so the form is so variable, that's hard to say.
Yeah.
But they are a deciduous tree, of course.
Yeah, and I mean the shape of an almond, it would be really good for sheltering a house, because it's got that arching tendency. And I actually had listed here plum trees for a similar reason, because I do have a positive test for plum trees. Only the guy did not specify whether it was Japanese or European, but low flammability when he tested it. So yeah, a little unsure about them. Do you know anything much about Cape chestnuts? I'm wondering if it would be too big for. Is the suggestion this is a suburban garden? Geelong?
It doesn't specify. No, it would likely be suburban. If it's in Geelong, it will be suburban. If it's on the outskirts, it could be peri-urban area.
Yeah,
I think, Leslie, you're right. Cape chestnut would be way too big.
Crepe myrtle could work. Now, I've had a lot of problem here in the west with the young crepe myrtles getting sun scorched on the leaves.
Right.
And I mean that's a growing issue as well with plants that would otherwise be good. London plane trees over here get so scorched in summer, and then there's a massive leaf drop mid-summer, just when you don't need it, Plus it means it hasn't got the green lush leaves. The leaves have to be green and lush to act as ember traps. As soon as they start getting diseased or sun scorched or droughted, then all bets are off, But crepe myrtle, I've looked at lots of ones around this area that are established, and they do seem to grow out of that. But they're so slow growing.
Can you perhaps share a little bit as well? We haven't talked too much around the fire resistant, or even some specific examples of fire resistant natives.
Well, I had a quick look at Leslie's book, and I was really surprised to see that Callistemon bottlebrush, as a group, generally, Leslie, are pretty low flammability.
I wouldn't agree as a group. There's CSIRO tests an unnamed. Sorry, I pronounce it callistum, you'll have to forgive me.
No, lots of people do.
And bottle brush was tested by CSIRO and was found to have low. Citrinus was found to be moderate,
Right.
and rigidus was found to be high.
Right.
So I think I've got one of each.
Okay.
But low, I can read you out a list of low natives if you want. Do you want me to?
Oh, yeah. Well, I would.
So, and it's tall kangaroo paw, so long as you get onto, removing the dead bits. Native frangipani, beautiful tree. Hymenospermum flavor.
Oh, yeah.
You know it? It's sweetly scented. And both the green and the dry leaf burned reluctantly. It's unusual to have the dry leaf also burning reluctantly. It does become pretty big eventually, and it has brittle branches. So you would want to plant it sheltered from strong winds and not too near a building. But it's beautiful. Hakea multilineata, the grass leaf hakea. Now that's a WA plant, and it doesn't like humidity. So I guess some parts of the eastern states that would work for.
And
yeah.
You did mention Elaeocarpus in a conversation we had recently being surprisingly flammable.
Blueberry ash, yeah, I've got disputed results on that. I think that the best was a moderate and one was high. Yeah. So Hakea macrayana, needlewood. Papalia pendula, which is tulip wood. Do you know that one?
No.
Okay, so that's an eastern state. So that was low to very low. Alocasuarina distyla, which is shrubby she oak. Now apparently that's good for erosion control.
Yeah.
And that one, the green leaf was low and the dry leaf was very low. So that's a really interesting one. Now, quite a few of the Alocasuarinas, there's a problem with dead stuff getting caught within the branches. I haven't seen it mentioned as being a problem for this one. So that would just be something that you'd want to find out a little bit more about. Because I know with one of the Alocasuarinas, it had a low rating, but with the rider, that highly aerated fuel caught in the trees was flammable. What about Myoporum insulari? Common
No, only the creeping bubiala, which is parvifolium.
Yeah. Persunia pinifolia, which is pine leaf geebung. Apparently it's beautiful.
Right, okay.
We've given a fairly good list, and I'm just conscious we're getting close to running out of time. There's still a mountain of questions, and I want to sort of see if we can answer a few more. We've got one here that's a little bit technical. What is your view on the prospect of converting hazard reduction fuel loads into biochar? Anyone game to answer that one?
Nope.
Nope.
It's a great concept.
It is, isn't it?
How achievable, I'm not in a position to say.
Okay, all right. Nigel, you might be better placed to answer this one from Robert. What about, we were talking much earlier on about water tanks. Someone's wanting to expand on that and asked about plastic bladders inside concrete or steel tanks.
Obviously, that's fine when it's entirely protected and enclosed. So obviously the water is secure. The only personal objection I have as an architect is that if the bladder keeps going up and down with the water content varying, as it will, the question I have is how long will the joints last? So personally, I haven't used them. They obviously have a place, but longevity would be my concern. No bushfire concern if they're entirely enclosed like that. Okay. I frequently use plastic tanks where the land falls away and you've got this void entirely enclosed. No problem with plastic in that context. No problem with bladders in that context. It's just when they're exposed to the air, to the heat, to the embers, that's when, you have to use non-combustible.
Okay, good. Coming back to planting again, what's the best planting for below the house on a fairly steep slope in a bushland area?
Well,
high moisture content.
So a steep slope below the house, first of all, you'd be looking at setting out.
Yes.
Going back to the setting out so that you have a defendable space. And then I think I'd be grading my plants so that you start with, once you actually start planting and you've left enough space for a defendable space, that you will start with low plants at the front and you'll be putting the taller plants much further back, and you'll be merging gradually with bushland.
Okay, great.
But can I point out that bushfire regulations talk about the 100 meters or 140 meters away from the house. It's a considerable distance. And if a significant fire, which of course increases markedly the steeper the slope, what they call the flame slope is well ahead. That flame could be 50 meters long. And of course it's preheating. And as it's shooting up that slope, it's a fundamental problem about slope and proximity of any planting, anything that will burn to a house. Key problem. We have to try and minimize that to the fullest extent with our location of housing and our garden planning and our vegetation management.
Yeah, that's obviously a really dangerous site as well, especially sloping fire rushes uphill much faster. Depending on how big the property is, I was wondering if this might actually be an occasion where mulberry might be useful. I'm very nervous about mulberries. I've experienced firsthand the roots invading. They march 17 meters into my property under the shed to reach the watered veggie garden. White mulberry is a weed, so don't go there. And the other problem with mulberry is they're very heavy pollinators, so people with asthma and allergies can have a problem with them. But putting all that aside, if you were putting them in a spot where their roots were not going to trouble your septic system, your house, your sheds, your neighbours' house and sheds and septic systems, I'm wondering if this might actually be quite a good barrier in that situation. Either of you got an opinion on that?
Other than that lovely story published by the ABC about the mulberry tree that saved a bush cottage.
Yeah.
But the proviso was it was very well watered. They allocated water to it during a very bad drought. And when they fled the cottage, it was lush and green, and they came back and the fire had split around the mulberry tree and bypassed the house as well.
I should also mention that when tested, it had no visible flame, which is pretty darn good.
Wow.
Okay.
So it just might be worth giving a bit of thought, but careful placement.
Yeah.
Heading well down south to the south of Tasmania, Heidi's asked, how useful do you think a dense hedge of dogwood well away from buildings would be? And it planted as a windbreak and an ember trap.
Well, first of all, dogwood's deciduous, and
there's different species of dogwood. So she's actually given the species, and it's a Pomaderus apatella.
Oh, I don't know the Pomaderus.
I think I have that one.
Our dogwoods in the mountains are cornus, and they're a bit weedy. So I don't know about the Pomaderus.
Okay.
I've got it in my book, and I'm just about to get there. Okay, conflicting reports. CSIRO found it had high flammability, and a Tasmanian researcher found that it had low flammability. So go figure. And moisture content was similar in the two tests, but the mineral ash content was significantly different.
Okay. Ember attack we did have a whole session on ember attack, but are there specific species that may be less susceptible to ignition from ember attack?
I have seen, and I saw this in the Windmill fires in 2013, some box hedging, which had been meticulously hedged, and it had this, and clearly well watered, and it had this really dense, fine foliage lining on the top and both sides. And it seemed to act as an ember filter.
Okay.
But, you know, plenty of provisos there about really well maintained. So it had a really dense outer layer, and it was in fine form, really good condition, and really soft and green.
Good advice. Stepping back to the actual around, like directly around the house, Elise has asked what size perimeter is recommended for a paved skirt around the house.
I'd say, well, it depends on how much room you've got. So in our urban setting, we'd be lucky to have 2 metres absolute max. At one point where the bathroom goes out, it's less than 1 metre. So
Okay.
I'm doing 1 metre around the edge, and then some ground cover
Further away.
to the fence. Yeah. Between the paving and the fence.
And what we have is 2 meters of paving and a low rock wall on follow straight against that on the western side, and then a lawn which you know, doesn't get very heavily watered, so calling it a lawn is probably incorrect. A patch of weeds mixed with lawn.
Nigel, there's probably a good question here for you around heading back to water systems. I'm conscious of time, so we'll perhaps maybe make this potentially our last question, or we might get time for one more. Anne in the ACT has asked, what cost-effective watering systems would you recommend as a retrofit to a medium-sized garden?
Cost-effective watering system. Frankly, don't know how to answer that one. Are we talking about watering the garden, or are we talking about retrofit for the building?
I'm not sure. When I first read it, I thought it was the building, but I think actually maybe it might be a Sue or Leslie question, because it says to a medium-sized garden. So maybe it's about the garden.
Mm.
Well, I only use trickle systems and, I lie, a sprinkler on the so-called lawn. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, there's many rural houses and even peri-urban houses that obviously have on-site effluent disposal. So that, of course, is putting moisture into the soil as well as nutrient. So again, it's this whole point about design and location and planning, so that you, on the likely fire approach side, you maximize your plants, your vegetation, everything which is moist and wet, as we've had anecdotally in some discussion this evening, to minimize the fire intensity coming to the house. Just important to, it's basically simple design, thinking about not only the garden, the climate, the soil, but looking at which direction is the most likely for fire, looking at what planting combinations further away and then up to closer to the house. How can you minimize burning embers near the house? How can you keep the immediate area moist, if not fully wet? It's all these fundamentals that are so important.
So also, I think you're looking at a two-part, and I've never thought of it like this before, but you're looking at a two-parter. You're looking at keeping the place watered normally, and then you're looking at maybe being able to apply water during a fire event. So if you're keeping the place watered as a general thing, I think trickle systems are the way to go. But if you wanted to spread water around during a fire event, you'd be going for sprinklers. Sprinklers as a whole kind of set of technical expertise. So I don't feel qualified to go into more detail than that.
Sure. I believe in our back issues of Renew and Sanctuary magazines that we do touch on some of these things as well. So worth having a look there too.
Do we have time to quickly touch on volatile oils?
Absolutely, yes. Yep, let's touch on that before we go.
Because people tend to be told that if a plant is aromatic, it's going to be flammable. But it actually depends what flammable oils are present, like the terpene limonene increases flammability, but the terpene acetyl acetate, I think it is, something like that, decreases it. So this is why you can get citrus. I've got tests for lemon and mandarin. They're both very aromatic leaves. And they test as positive, and they're used as fuel breaks in the Mediterranean from villages near forests, so long as the weeds are kept low. So don't automatically assume that all aromatic plants have high flammability.
And does that, with the oils, does that also, is there differences in terms of native eucalypts as well?
Oh, massive differences, and even within one tree, like there's a lot of info out there on this actually, because eucalyptus oil is an industry. So they need to know what percentage volatiles they'll be able to extract. And, you'll have one tree that's 6% if it's taken from here, and, 4% if it's taken from there. So, yeah, very, very variable.
I've also wondered about the conifers, if it was maybe aromatic oils in conifers that led to maybe differences in their flammability.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah.
And of course, we're in the Blue Mountains, and of course, it's called blue because it's the evaporation of volatile eucalypt oils. And of course, when a fire comes through, that's part of the dramatic flash of flame and heat and intensity, because obviously the leaves are dying, the heat, and it's the flame from the oils racing across the canopies, quite separate from the ground level fire quite often.
Okay, well, we might start wrapping it up. Nigel, if I come to you first and give the others forewarning, that's unfair, isn't it? If you could give the audience one key takeaway in relation to water or landscaping, what would that be from your perspective? Maximise
your stored water. Have it available for when the emergency comes through. Keep wetness, dampness close to the building, assuming that's the key point you want to maintain. And we've heard about all the good things about the planting, the use of gravel, paving, all those things close to the house. They're the most fundamental. Okay, I think you cheated there. I think you had much more than one, but that's all good advice. All part of the same. Susan.
Design it, for heaven's sake, plan it, and with all the things in mind that we've discussed. How's that for brevity?
Very good. And Leslie?
Maintenance. Just keep on top of it. And if a plant is high maintenance, don't buy it if you don't think you've got the strength or the energy to keep on top of it.
Fantastic. Okay. All right. Well, I think we'll start to wrap it up now. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. You've all done a fabulous job. You've given us so much information to take away. And we really appreciate Leslie, Nigel and Susan all sharing your time and expertise. So we'll say goodbye to you now. And we also will say thank you to all of our attendees for tuning into this session and for your questions. They were coming in thick and fast, so I apologise if we didn't get to them all. I think we covered a fair bit of territory, but you know, it's always difficult with so many people online to get through them all, but I hope you've all managed to take something really valuable away. Please note that there's one more session in this retrofitting book for bushfire resilience series, and that's really about energy setups. So go and visit the Sustainable House Day website to check out the details and register if you'd like to tune in for that one as well. And you can also check out other events that are coming up there. We've introduced an annual pass for all of our Sustainable House Day events. So that means that the events throughout the entire year end up costing around $3 an event if you take out that annual pass. Don't forget that members of Renew receive free or discounted tickets, and we always have an allocation of free places for those experiencing financial difficulty. This is really important information, and we want everyone to be able to have access to it. So thank you all again for being part of this evening, and wishing you all a very good night.